Imagine being trapped inside a castle, surrounded by enemies, patiently waiting for the moment when hunger, thirst, or desperation forces your surrender. How is it possible to resist for months, or even years, without reinforcements? Today we'll uncover the ingenious strategies that made medieval castles nearly impenetrable fortresses. From hidden food reserves to deadly traps, every detail was designed to frustrate invaders. And by the end, you'll discover the story of a castle that never fell, despite being under siege for years. The castle as a fortress, walls, towers, and defenses. A castle wasn't just a home for nobility. It was a war machine built to withstand relentless attacks. Every part of its design was meant to slow down, weaken, and ultimately repel the enemy. Massive walls, the first line of defense. The outer walls of medieval castles were thick and tall, making them nearly impossible to breach with conventional weapons. These walls often featured high elevation to prevent easy scaling with ladders, sloped bases, known as glacis, to deflect projectiles and discourage tunneling, double or even triple layers to ensure that even if one wall fell, the defenders still had protection. Some castles even had concentric defenses, multiple walls surrounding each other, forcing attackers to breach several layers before reaching the heart of the fortress. Towers, the ultimate defensive advantage. Castle towers provided defenders with higher ground, allowing them to rain arrows, stones, and boiling liquids on attackers. Round towers instead of square ones, as they were more resistant to battering rams and sappers. Machicolations, overhanging sections from which defenders could drop projectiles on enemies below. Arrow slits, or loopholes, that allowed archers to fire safely from within. Reinforced gates and drawbridges. The entrance was the most vulnerable point of a castle, but medieval engineers reinforced it with heavy iron portcullises, metal grates that could drop instantly to trap invaders. Murder holes, openings in ceilings above gateways used to drop hot oil, stones, or even boiling water on intruders. Drawbridges that could be raised to cut off access over moats. A well-built castle was not just a place to live, it was a stronghold designed for survival, securing food and water supplies for a long siege. A castle's walls could keep enemies out, but the real challenge of a prolonged siege was survival from within. Without a steady supply of food and water, the defenders would eventually starve or be forced to surrender. This is why medieval castles were meticulously prepared to sustain their inhabitants for months or even years under siege. Massive food storage and preservation. One of the first steps before a siege was to stockpile as much food as possible. Medieval lords ordered the collection of grains and flour, which could last for years when stored properly. Salted and smoked meat, preventing spoilage without refrigeration. Dried fruits, nuts, and legumes, which provided essential nutrients. Large castles often had dedicated storage rooms and granaries, sometimes hidden underground to keep food cool and away from pests. Livestock and agriculture inside the castle. Some castles were so well prepared that they had their own self-sustaining farms within their walls. These included small herds of livestock, such as chickens, pigs, and goats, which provided fresh meat, eggs, and milk. Vegetable gardens, ensuring a steady supply of food even when external supply lines were cut. Beekeeping, which provided honey as both a sweetener and a preservative. In larger castles with inner courtyards, fields of grain could even be planted, allowing the defenders to harvest food while under siege. The most important resource, water, was even more crucial than food. Castles located near rivers or lakes had direct access to fresh water, but others relied on deep wells dug inside the castle to ensure a continuous water supply. Rainwater collection systems, using cisterns to store water. Hidden underground springs, which were considered highly valuable and often kept secret. Defenders who secured their food and water supplies could outlast attackers who had to rely on their own supply chains, proving that in a siege, starvation could be just as deadly as swords and arrows. Defending against direct assaults, traps, arrows, and boiling oil. Even with strong walls and well-stocked supplies, a castle under siege had to prepare for direct attacks. Defenders used a combination of strategic positioning, ranged weapons, and deadly traps to make any assault a costly and terrifying endeavor for the enemy. Archers and crossbowmen, the first line of active defense. From the safety of high walls and towers, archers could fire at invaders long before they reached the gates. Castles were designed with arrow slits, loopholes, narrow openings allowing defenders to shoot while remaining protected. Elevated firing positions, giving archers a greater range and accuracy. Crossbows for powerful armor-piercing shots, capable of penetrating chainmail. Longbows were particularly feared, as they could pierce enemy armor from a great distance, making it dangerous for attackers to even approach the walls. Boiling liquids and burning projectiles. When soldiers attempted to storm the walls, defenders used heated and flammable substances to repel them. Boiling oil or water, poured through murder holes to scald attackers climbing ladders or breaking through gates. Burning tar and pitch, which could set siege towers and battering rams on fire. Flaming arrows shot into wooden siege engines or enemy encampments to spread chaos. These tactics weren't just painful, they were psychological weapons, striking fear into the hearts of attackers. Deadly traps and hidden defenses. Castles weren't just strong, they were designed to trick and trap enemies. Some of the most effective defensive tricks included false entrances, leading invaders into dead ends where they could be ambushed. Concealed pits filled with spikes or water to trap and injure soldiers. Rolling boulders and heavy logs, which could be dropped on enemies attempting to break through gates. Defenders who used these methods effectively could weaken, demoralize, and devastate attackers, proving that brute force alone wasn't enough to breach a well-prepared castle. Psychological warfare, breaking the enemy's will. A siege wasn't just a battle of weapons, it was a battle of endurance, deception, and morale. Many castles survived long sieges, not only because of their strong defenses, but because they outlasted or outwitted their enemies through psychological warfare. Faking abundance to demoralize the enemy. One of the most clever tricks used by castle defenders was pretending they had unlimited supplies, even when they were running low. Some strategies included throwing food over the walls to make it seem like they had excess to spare, releasing well-fed animals to trick the enemy into thinking the defenders weren't starving, having soldiers sing and make noise to project strength and confidence. If the besieging army believed the defenders could hold out indefinitely, they might abandon the siege rather than waste time and resources. Psychological warfare. Through fear and deception, castles often used fear and intimidation to weaken enemy morale, hanging enemy prisoners where the attacking army could see as a warning, displaying severed heads or enemy banners showing that previous assaults had failed, catapulting disease-ridden corpses into enemy camps, spreading fear and sickness. Even without modern propaganda, medieval defenders understood that war wasn't just physical, it was mental. Fake reinforcements and false surrenders. Some castles managed to trick their enemies into retreating through deception, lighting extra torches at night to make their numbers seem larger, sending messengers with fake reports of reinforcements arriving, pretending to negotiate surrender, only to launch a surprise counterattack when the enemy lowered their guard. These tactics often forced attackers to question their own chances of victory, sometimes causing them to abandon the siege altogether. By using psychological warfare, castle defenders could win battles without ever drawing a sword. Counterattacks, sapping, raids, and secret tunnels. A castle under siege didn't always stay on the defensive. Sometimes the best strategy was to strike back. Even when outnumbered, defenders used clever tactics like raids, underground warfare, and ambushes to weaken the enemy. Raids on enemy camps, striking at night. Defenders often launched small surprise attacks on the besieging army. Nighttime raids, when visibility was low and guards were tired. Fire attacks setting enemy siege weapons and supplies ablaze. Targeting food stores, forcing the attackers to ration supplies or starve. Since besieging armies relied on supply lines from nearby towns or allies, cutting off these resources could turn the siege against them. Tunnels and underground warfare sieges often turned into battles beneath the ground. Attackers used sapping, digging tunnels under castle walls to make them collapse. But defenders had their own underground tactics, counter tunnels to intercept and ambush enemy diggers, flooding tunnels with water to prevent sappers from advancing, setting fire to underground supports, causing tunnels to collapse on the attackers. Some castles even had secret escape tunnels, allowing defenders to sneak out for reinforcements or supplies, feigning weakness to lure the enemy. In a desperate castle could sometimes fake a retreat to bait the enemy into a trap, opening the gates slightly to make it seem like defenders were surrendering, drawing attackers inside, then sealing off their escape routes, launching a counterattack once the enemy was inside the kill zone. A well-timed counterattack could turn a siege into a disaster for the attackers, proving that even a surrounded castle could still fight back. Disease, starvation, and the brutal reality of a long siege. While sieges were often won through military strategy, many were decided by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. A prolonged siege wasn't just deadly for the defenders, it was also a nightmare for the attackers. The hidden killer, Disease inside the castle. A castle packed with soldiers, civilians, and livestock was a breeding ground for disease. With limited sanitation and fresh air, sickness spread quickly. Dysentery and cholera from contaminated water. Typhus and plague carried by rats and fleas. Respiratory infections due to overcrowded, damp conditions. Doctors were scarce, and medieval medicine was often ineffective, meaning that illness could kill more people than enemy weapons. Starvation, the slowest death in a siege. Even the best-stocked castles couldn't hold out forever. As food supplies ran low, defenders had to ration portions, eating less each day to stretch supplies. Eat horses, dogs, and even rats, anything to survive. Boil leather from boots and belts, a desperate last resort. Historical accounts describe sieges where people resorted to cannibalism, eating the dead when there was no other option. The attackers also suffered. Sieges weren't easy for the besieging army either. Without proper hygiene or supply lines, they faced their own challenges. Food shortages, especially if local resources were depleted. Desertion, as soldiers abandoned their posts rather than starve. Disease outbreaks, since they camped outside in unsanitary conditions. Some armies were forced to lift the siege because they couldn't survive longer than the defenders. In many cases, the true victors of a siege weren't the strongest warriors, but those who could outlast the suffering. The castle that never fell, legendary sieges and ultimate defenses. Some castles were so well defended that they withstood sieges for years, and in some cases were never conquered at all. These legendary fortresses proved that a well-prepared defense could outlast even the most determined attackers. Rochester Castle, 1215. A siege that pushed defenses to the limit. During the First Barons' War, King John of England besieged Rochester Castle, which was held by rebel barons. His army used giant siege towers to assault the walls, a massive battering ram to break through the gates, a tunnel filled with fire and pig fat to collapse part of the keep. Despite these efforts, the defenders held out for nearly 2 months before starvation forced their surrender. Malahide Castle, Ireland. Never taken by force. Built in the 12th century, Malahide Castle survived centuries of conflict, but was never taken by siege. Its natural defenses and strategic position made it nearly impossible to attack. Even when enemy forces occupied Ireland, they never managed to breach its walls. Château Gaillard, France. A castle built to withstand anything. Constructed by Richard the Lionheart, Château Gaillard was considered impenetrable. It featured multiple layers of walls, forcing attackers to break through several defenses. Advanced arrow slits, allowing defenders to fire from all angles. A perfect cliffside location, making direct assaults nearly impossible. The castle eventually fell in 1204, but only after a long and grueling siege, proving that even the strongest fortresses could only hold out for so long. What made these castles unbreakable? The key to their success was a combination of strategic location, using cliffs, rivers, or mountains as natural defenses. Smart architecture with multiple layers of fortifications. Preparedness, ensuring long-term food and water supplies. Some castles were so well built that they outlasted history itself, standing today as monuments to medieval military genius. How castles evolved to resist longer sieges. As siege tactics became more advanced, medieval castles had to evolve to remain impenetrable. From stronger walls to new defensive structures, castle designs constantly adapted to counter the latest threats. From wooden forts to stone strongholds. Early medieval castles were often made of wood, which was vulnerable to fire and battering rams. Over time, castle builders switched to thick stone walls, which were resistant to siege engines like catapults and trebuchets. Too strong for battering rams to break through easily. More durable against fire and tunneling attacks. This shift made castles much harder to breach by force, forcing attackers to rely more on prolonged sieges. Concentric castles, the ultimate defense. By the 13th century, concentric castles became the gold standard of medieval fortification. These castles featured multiple layers of walls, so even if one was breached, another stood behind it. Towers placed at different angles, allowing defenders to fire at enemies from multiple directions. Moats and drawbridges, creating additional barriers against invaders. These designs made sieges much more difficult, as attackers had to fight through several layers of defense just to reach the inner keep. The decline of castles, the age of gunpowder. No castle could withstand every threat forever. By the 15th century, the invention of gunpowder and cannons changed warfare forever. Cannons could shatter stone walls, making even the thickest fortifications obsolete. Sieges became shorter, as artillery bombardments replaced starvation tactics. Fortresses evolved into star-shaped bastions, better suited to deflect cannon fire. As a result, traditional castles gradually lost their military importance, and many were abandoned or repurposed. However, their legacy remains, as symbols of medieval strength, strategy, and resilience. Conclusion: the answer to our opening question. Now that we've explored the defenses, strategies, and secrets of medieval castles, we can finally answer our original question. How did castles shield their inhabitants during prolonged sieges? The answer lies in a combination of strong fortifications, clever tactics, resource management, and psychological warfare. Castles weren't just buildings, they were living fortresses, designed to outlast any enemy, no matter how powerful or persistent. Surviving a siege wasn't just about having high walls or strong gates. It required careful preparation, strategic deception, and absolute resilience. Defenders needed to outthink their attackers, making them believe that victory was impossible, even when supplies were dwindling. They relied on food reserves, secret water sources, and even counterattacks to keep the enemy off balance. Every part of a castle's design had a purpose: to delay, weaken, and break the morale of the besieging army. But despite their strength, castles were not invincible. As warfare evolved and new weapons emerged, even the mightiest fortresses faced challenges they could no longer withstand. The rise of gunpowder and cannons marked the beginning of the end for medieval castles as military strongholds. Walls that had once stood for centuries could now be shattered in days. The tactics of siege warfare changed forever, and the era of the traditional castle came to a close. Yet, even today, these ancient fortresses stand as monuments to medieval ingenuity and determination. They remind us of a time when battles were won not just by brute force, but by strategy, endurance, and the will to survive. Some castles, once thought impenetrable, still hold their secrets, and their stories continue to captivate historians, architects, and enthusiasts alike. So, next time you see a towering medieval castle, imagine the lives of those who lived behind its walls: the soldiers, the noble families, and the common folk who endured months, even years, under siege. In the face of overwhelming odds, they stood firm, proving that sometimes the best offense is an unbreakable defense.